We are recording the interview of George Snook. This interview is being conducted by Jennifer Seavey from Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. Also in attendance is Red Ketchum, Bob Seitz, and Bob Stuckey. This interview is being recorded at the Champaign Aviation Museum in Urbana, Ohio. It is 9:15 a.m. on February 6, 2016. Okay, George. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Ashland, Ohio in December 26, 1920. And if my addition is right, that makes me 95.
Okay.
I've been married to my wife, Barbara, for 55 years. And we have 4 children. Melody is the oldest. Terry and Tom are my 2 sons and daughters. Both of them live in the Toledo area. And we have 1 daughter, Tanya, deceased.
Okay. Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
What's that?
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My dad worked at a faultless rubber company, and they made balls, balloons, and what have you. And we lived on the edge of town, and we had 5 acres in our little bit. There were 7 of us children in our family, so we always had a huge garden. And during the good year, Mother was in charge of the garden, and my older brother and I done all the work. On a good year, we'd bring in 20 bushels of potatoes and put in the coal cellar downstairs. Mother only had to buy the basics of flour, sugar, and salt, and we raised everything else. We had chickens, so we always had plenty of meat. We always had eggs, and at one time we had rabbits, but we got rid of those. So as it was 7 in the family, you learned to work early and late, and Mother couldn't afford to buy us a lot of stuff and give it to us. So I started out working for my neighbor across the street when I was fairly young. All I did was take in the coal and haul out the ashes, and I got a quarter a week. That quarter would get me to a movie and buy me a milkshake at that time. Later on, when I was in high school, I started working at an airport. And the owner of the airport, Walt Shuey, he had a Piper Cub. And at this time, in the early 40s, you had to hand crank them. They were not battery operated. That was the first thing you had to learn. The other owner there had a Fairchild bi-wing open cockpit, and I got to ride in all of them. I'd work on weekends at the filling station, and several times I'd go out in the morning and open up the station. Nothing's happening. Walt would come in and say, "Lock the door, else you and I take a ride." So we'd crank up the Piper Cub and fly around the city. By the time we got back, there'd be 6 or 8 cars there. All the fellows came out for hangar talk. So I have a love of airplanes early, and I never have lost it.
Okay. So you said you had 7 siblings. Did they serve at all in the military?
My older brother Ed was in the Army, and he served the South Pacific. My younger brother served in the Navy. My older sister was a nurse at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and my younger sister was a cadet. Yes, I think 5 of us were active in the service at one time. So not 1 star on the door, Mother had 5.
All right. So what were you doing before you entered the service?
I started working at a printing company, and I worked for them until I went in the war. I went into service. Then when I came out of the service, I went back and worked for them again. And one day, union shop, one day the boss comes by and says, "George, you're doing a good job. I'm going to give you a raise." Payday came, I looked at that paycheck, and I looked at it. He gave me a penny. A nickel at that time would have been fantastic, and a dime would have been extra good. So I was complaining at the local pub that night to some of the fellas, and they said, "Come down to the OPS," which later became the High Edison Company, and they were selling appliances. I went down the next day and applied, and they hired me on the site on the first time interview, and I went to work the next day. And I finally, after selling appliances, I moved up to charge of the department and worked out of Mansfield for 6 years in charge of the sales and service department. Then the company went out of the appliance business, and I was fortunate to be transferred to Springfield and spent my next 13 years working in the marketing part there at Springfield. Total of 38 years with the High Edison Company, and very enjoyable.
Okay. So you were in the Army. Were you active duty or guard or reserve?
I was drafted into the service,
Okay.
and at that time it's called the Army Air Corps. And I went down to Dayton, Ohio to join the Army Air Corps. They said, come back in 2 weeks and we'll take you. I got home, opened the mailbox. Guess what? I was drafted. And we went to Akron, had a physical. The old story goes, if you were warm, you passed. Put up your right hand, you were foreign into the military. They sent you home for 2 weeks to take care of personal business. Now, at 22, how long does it take a 22-year-old to take care of business? I gave my mother the power of attorney, and I sold my car. And 2 weeks later, we were off to Clemens, Ohio, where we got our uniforms, and then to Camp Atterbury, Indiana for basic training. And that was in the fall of the year. And I was only there for a short period of time. We took tests, and we went to the hospital and got all the shots that the military gives you. And in short order, I got orders to go to Lincoln, Nebraska to take the aircraft mechanic school. Excellent school, ran by civilians. I graduated with good grades. And from there, I went to Salt Lake City for assignment. They said, we need gunners. And if you graduate and start flying, you get 50% more base pay. So I said, well, let's go for the money. So off I go to Windover Field, Utah, and I passed that. We fired everything that the military owned at that time, from small arm fires, even fired the old Springfield rifle, then finally 30 calibers and 50 calibers like you see here on the counter. So I had a good basic training to start with.
Okay, so how do you feel then overall how you adapted to military life?
Well, I think the first thing you learned at Camp Atterbury was you learn how to march. The second thing you learn is discipline, and that's the most important thing in the military. At that stage, I thought a corporal was a general, but then I found out later that he wasn't. But I made tech sergeant, and I wasn't any more ranked than the corporal was at that time. But you adapt to the military very quickly, and I did, I think.
So, did you serve abroad?
After gunnery school, we went back to Salt Lake City, and then we went to Sioux City, Iowa, and that's where 10 people came together to form a crew on a B-24. We started training there day and night, and after we had trained there for quite a long period of time, we ended up in Pocatello, Idaho, where we'd done air-to-ground firing from the B-24. And one day the pilot got notice that they were transferring 3 of our crews into Sioux City, where they had lost 3 crews in training. So we were on a train, and pretty soon we were in Sioux City, and that's when we walk in, the 703rd Squadron, and this is where I met my squadron CO for the first time. Jimmy Stewart was our CO. The only thing I'll say about him, he was a squadron commander. He was a bomber pilot. He was not an actor. He never permitted professional photographers to follow him around the base and take pictures. I'm fortunate. I took this picture overseas at Tibbenham in March of 1944, and he was very gracious to the people that served with and under him. So I'm happy to have that picture. But after we'd finished our training, we went to Lincoln, Nebraska, and it was in November of 1943, and they issued machetes. I said, well, I guess we're going south. So we island hopped all the way down to South America. The only thing I can remember about Berlin, South America, it's the last time I had bananas until I got home again. Fresh food was almost a forbidden bit in England. No apples, no peaches, no bananas, no nothing. But we hopped off from there and went over to Africa at Dakar. Then from there up to Marrakech in North Africa, and then into England and to our base in Tibbenham. 13 days from the time we left stateside until we ended up at our base. And there we met the colonel of the base. The colonel his name was Colonel Terrell. He had the wings, the star, and the reef, 5,000 flying hours. He was an old timer in the Air Corps and an excellent pilot. I had the opportunity to fly with him on a few occasions. So after some more training in England, on December 13th, 1943, we made our first mission in Haphazard, our airplane, to Kiel, Germany, and returned safely.
So what were your duties while you were deployed?
I don't get that one.
What were your duties while deployed?
I was the engineer gunner on the B-24. I was from the old school. I like to pre-plate that airplane myself. First mission I flew, I crawled up on the wings to check our gas tanks. And the first sergeant in charge of the aircraft on the ground says, "George, I've already checked the tanks, they're full." I said, "Yes, but I'm flying it." They were never sealed, and I visually made sure that we had 3,000 gallons in our main tank and 250 in our auxiliary tanks. Now, we had sight gauges inside, but I wanted to make sure that we had enough gas for the missions, because some of them were 10 hours or more. You needed all the gas that you had. And the first thing you learn when you're off, you're getting information before you fly overseas, fly over to the continent. The first thing you learn, you transfer that gas from the auxiliary tank into the main tank before you start into the combat area. Some of the guys that later on came back, they ran out of gas. They had auxiliary gas, but they couldn't get to it because flak had shut out their electrical system. So I always like to make this statement. You learn by the book, but boy, experience takes over pretty soon. And I don't care what you do, experience is your final teacher.
Okay. Did you witness any combat? Is there anything you'd like to share?
When I started flying in 1943, the fighters would take us to the channel and turn around and go home. They didn't have enough gas to take you to the target. We were up to about our 10th mission before they finally, the P-51s and 47s got belly tanks and could take you over the target. Did you see enemy fighters? Pardon my French, hell yes. On our second mission, we were hit by Ju-88s. Combat became old hat to all of us. And primarily ME-109s was the favorite of the Germans. They had a habit of coming out of the sun high, so you learned to know where they were, and you learned to take care of yourself, and you learned to shoot at them. When I shot at them, there was probably 3 or 4 more airplanes shooting at the same time. But we seen a lot of combat.
So what kinds of friendships and camaraderie did you form while serving? And anyone in particular that you remember?
Well, the main thing you learn in a hurry is 10 people become one on the crew. Our pilot was an old man. He was 37. The rest of us were all in the 22 or 23 years of age. The radio operator and I probably became the best of friends of all of them. He was from Binghamton, New York. Pilot was from Florida. Co-pilot was from Arkansas. tours from Ohio. Oh, the bombardier was a Brooklynite. All he had to do was open his mouth and you knew where he was from. And well, the tail gunner was from Alabama, and we had one from North Carolina. So we were all over. But the crew became one, and we worked as a crew. And I think this is true of all the people that flew in combat. You had to work as a team to make it over and back safely, and we did.
So how did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
Well, at that time you could write letters, or they had what they call an email. Electronically would be posted, you write it and it went home. You were heavily censored on anything you wrote. Yeah. So I finally found out, writing to my mother was about the only one I wrote to regular. I told her, you asked the question of what missions I flew and what date I flew, and then all I have to do is answer yes or no. So I could get by the censors, because I couldn't write down I flew on such and such a date. They'd wipe it out immediately. So she'd ask questions, and then all I had to do was answer yes or no to what dates I was flying. So we could convey messages back and forth by yes and no. So, but my mother was the only one I corresponded to on a regular basis. When you were flying, I think I said you got 50% more base pay for flying. You got 20% more for being overseas. I sent $50 home on every payday to my mother because I wanted to buy a car when I got home. So the Army serves you almost everything you need as far as food. At that period of time, we were all heavy smokers, but cigarettes were cheap. So we did smoke and had an PX where you could get those. A lot of times Red Cross would give them to you for nothing. So you didn't hurt for anything.
Good. So what did you do when you were not on a mission?
Well, I flew in the upper turret. I usually stood between the pilot and the co-pilot until we got to the channel. And then I would crawl up in my turret, and it was a sit-down turret with electronic sight. And the first thing, the pilot would have you all check in to make sure your system was all working. We're flying at 18 to 20,000 feet. We're 30 to 40 below zero. We all had heated suits on, and the pilot would check in to make sure your suits were working and your communications was fine. And that happened quite frequently, not just once, but several times. He'd call, check in, and it started with the navigator, bombardier, and went right on back to the tail gunner to make sure you were all safe in the aircraft.
Okay. Did you have any time for recreation while you were overseas?
When we came back from a mission, we would be debriefed. The flight surgeon would walk around and check with each crew. And after you'd put in a few missions, the flight surgeon would say, I think you guys need a vacation. You got 5 days coming. Well, at first we went to London, but everybody went to London. The place was crowded. And I never stayed in the Red Cross facilities. We could stay at the Savoy Hotel for about $5 American and have a private bath and so forth. So we always stayed there, and of course, the Air Corps, unfortunately, we had more money than anyone else. So, and then finally, we started going to Scotland. What a beautiful place to go to Edinburgh, Scotland. The people just treated you royally. I could get a 5-day pass to Scotland, and I had friends up at headquarters. I could get a 2-day pass on top of that. Then you go out on the flight line and say, who's flying into Scotland? And pretty soon you'd find a crew who was taking a training flight up to Prestwick, Scotland, so you could fly that far and take the train in. Your 2-day pass started when you were there. So we spent a lot of time in Scotland, and I have some wonderful pictures that we took with the families that we met and the people we met. They just treated you fantastically. So that was our recreation, Scotland.
Okay. So when it was time to come home, how did you feel about that?
Well, when I finished combat in June 27, 1944, some of the people that, crews that went home ahead of us were training on B-29s to go to Japan. So the radio operator and I decided to stay overseas. And wasn't long that a major came along and says, I need 2 guys to run the NCO club. And I said, what happened to the 2 guys that were there before? And he said, well, they're probably in prison by now. But we went down to the building they had. There was no whiskey, no beer, no money. We had slot machines. Within a 30-day period, we had all the beer and scotch they could drink. And we read the radio operator, and I read that. We hired people to clean up. We hired a bookkeeper. We had a checking account, and we read it like a business. And we did that until the war was over. And they told us, well, when the war's over, you got to give everything you got to the Red Cross. So as we approached that period of time, I went to London and bought all the scotch I could from the dealer, and took it back and sold it to the fellows that were members for 50 cents a bottle. And I still had returns of empty bottles and soft drinks and barrels, and so we still had plenty of money to give the Red Cross.
Okay. So how did you return home?
Well, can I tell you about this one mission? I have one mission I want to tell you a story about, and that's on 27th of February, 1944. We were flying this airplane, 9 Yanks and a jerk, and go ahead if you want to get a picture of it. We were coming off the target at Nuremberg. We took an 88 shell up through the bomb bay. It missed me in the upper turret. It missed the radio operator sitting there, and then it hit the armor plating behind the pilot and blew out through the side. And if you look closely at the picture, you can see a hole in the side. You can see my parachute and shoes being blown out through that hole. And when we got back to the channel, I crawled out and took a look at it. We lost our hydraulic system to the main wheel. We lost our communications to the waist. I carried a pair of pliers with me. I pinched off all the hydraulic lines going to the main wheel. Now in the front we had tanks, accumulating tanks, so I knew we had enough pressure for brakes and flaps one time. So as we approached the airport, radio operator fires a red flare to give us preferential landing. I walk out into the bomb bay, and there's a handle up overhead, 25 turns, the main wheel comes down, the waist gunner goes thumbs up, it's down and locked. I go up to the front to toss out that nose wheel. I weighed about 138 pounds at that time, it weighs several hundred. I pitched it out, it would not lock. So I came up and told the pilot, and on the ground it was Captain Williams. When we were flying, it was Mac. I said, Mac, we got a problem. So if you put any weight on that wheel, that airplane's going to collapse. He ordered everyone to the tail. He and the co-pilot brought that aircraft in on the main wheels, nose high, all the way down the runway, turned off toward our hard stand. It collapsed. Very little damage to the airplane whatsoever. First guy to greet us was our squadron commander, Jimmy Stewart. Comes up and says, "Want to make sure you were all right." Some of the guys got out and kissed the ground, and I'm told later that he and the pilot went out and hung one on that night to celebrate that, bringing that aircraft back and landed it safely. So that's about the only time that we really had any serious problems flying, was on that particular aircraft. But you heard me say, experience kicks in. You learn in a hurry what to do when you're flying combat. And I like to say, if you can land safely and walk away, it's a good landing. I walked away 30 times.
There you go. Okay. So when you came home, how were you received by your family and the community?
Well, probably not as bad as the Vietnam War, but there was no big celebration whatsoever. Here, I flew into, when the war was over, and I said, am I taking the boat home? They said, no, you're flying. Went up to Prestwick, Scotland, had a B-24 there. High-man crew crawled aboard, 10 passengers. We flew the northern route home. We were supposed to go into Massachusetts, but they were too busy, so we landed at Bangor, Maine. What a beautiful sight to land in the United States at a place where the beautiful pine trees, nice weather, and a PX where you could get milkshakes and get a good cold beer for a change. And then from there, we went to Massachusetts. We were sent home for a 30-day vacation. And then I went back into Camp Atterbury, and at that point in time in the service, you had points to get out. I had beaucoup points, and they said, well, let's see, you're an engineer and you're a gunner. We may need you. Sent me to Florida for 30 days vacation at Miami Beach, and from there they finally sent me out to Liberal, Kansas, in the middle of nothing. They said there's a girl behind every tree, and there wasn't a tree within 100 miles of that place. Anyhow, I was there until Lawrence Tippett dropped the bomb over in Japan, and the war ended very quickly after that. We had birds in the air that night, or that day, and as soon as the war, when I was announced on TV, and all the guys ran, and we were in a dry area, but I never seen so much whiskey come out of trunks in my life. That all the crew took off. I said, hey, we got airplanes up there that we got to get down. I was working on the ground crew at that time. And so I stayed until we got the birds back on the ground safely. And the next day I go to headquarters, and I said, you know, they're going to be discharging us very soon. You think you can get my name to the top of the list? And they did. So in short order, I was heading back to Camp Atterbury, and then home from there.
Okay. So how did you readjust to civilian life?
You know, I don't, they talk about that today. I don't think we had any serious problem that I know of. It's just like they say, were you scared when you were flying? No. I'm just like the kids today. You're going to live forever. Nothing's going to happen to you. And that's the way we were. Unfortunately, the Air Corps had the highest percentage of loss of any of the groups overseas. In early February '43, on one mission, we lost 60 bombers. And that's times 10. So you can see the losses were tremendous in our period of time. I knock on wood, I'm still here. I made my 30 missions, and I came back safely. And I thank that good guy upstairs every day for each day I have on this good earth.
Good. So have you remained in contact with any of your fellow veterans over there?
I was in contact with the radio operator for a long period of time, and I visited him at his home in New York City, or in Binghamton, New York, pardon me. And also when he went to Florida, I visited him down in Florida. I called my pilot once, and he was supposed to meet us at Hilton Head for a meeting. He didn't come, and I called him. I said, you still smoking those damn Camels? And he said, yeah, it's too late to quit. And it was too late, because it wasn't long he was gone. I am the only survivor of our crew. The rest of them are all gone. So at 95, I'm lucky. I'm still here.
Yep. So are you a member of any veterans organizations?
I've been a member of the American Legion for 69 years. I was post commander. It takes 3 years to get there. I went into district and was active in the district. That's 10 counties in northern Ohio, and I tried to visit every post in that area at least once. In some areas like Mansfield, Sandusky, and Elyria, I was there many, many times. You swore in the new officers when they came aboard. I've had the opportunity to speak at Memorial Day, and I've had the opportunity on Veterans Day to speak quite frequently. So yes, I've been busy. After that, one day, my wife was still working. She worked for the Elk Springs Instrument Company, and one day I said, boy, there's got to be something to do besides play golf and mow the lawn. I started going to elder hostel programs, educational programs held throughout the United States. I've attended 24 of those programs from Detroit to Washington, D.C. to Florida a couple times, in Kentucky and Texas and Arizona. So I've been all over. And I only went, my wife went with me on the last one to Savannah, Georgia. So yes, I've been busy. And I think that's the way you gotta live and have a long life. You can't sit in a chair and rock. You gotta get up and move around and do something every day.
Okay. So how are you a part of the Dayton Honor Flight?
I was there when they dedicated the World War II Memorial. My son and daughter took me there. The only problem is there was 100,000 people there and you couldn't see nothing. So 5 years ago, I got the opportunity to go on a honor flight, and a young lady I met there that was escorting us around, I said, and what are you doing in Washington, D.C.? She says, I'm taking graduate work. I said, well, where did you graduate from? She says, Bowling Green. I said, oh my goodness, my son and daughter both graduated from Bowling Green. So we hit it off real well. She escorted me around that place, and she knew everything there was to know about that World War II memorial. We even got down to, we seen the whole bit that they have here. And if you walk outside and down a little hole, you can see where Kilroy was here. A lot of people go and don't see Kilroy, but he is there on the wall. So, yes, I've been to honor flight. And then when you come home, they give you a certificate. Your family is there. There's a band there. There's an honor guard there. You're treated royally more than you were when you left the service. Yes.
Good.
I have one bit of trivia when you're all done.
Okay. All right. So how did your wartime experiences affect your life?
Well, it makes you more aware of every day that you're here, that God has given you permission to be here and to fulfill your life to its fullest every day that you're here. War experience, a lot of people have problems with it, but I don't. I love talking about the service that I was in. I'm proud of what I done in the service. So, don't bother me what I do.
So what are some life lessons you learned from your military service?
I did hear that.
What are some life lessons you learned from your service?
Well, the first thing you learn is discipline, and you learn how to do things and complete your message or whatever you're doing. Military service is good, and I've always advocated that every kid that graduates out of high school ought to have at least 3 to 6 months of military service. They would learn discipline in a hurry, and we wouldn't have some of the problems that we're having today with young people.
So how has your military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
I got to be careful how I answer this one. During the war, we had people that knew what they were doing. We had generals like Patton, who was famous for moving in and moving his tanks across the country. We had a general like Eisenhower that was famous for what he done. Squadron commander like Jimmy Stewart that knew what he was doing, and our squadron leader. Quite different what we have today.
Gotcha. What message would you like to leave for future generations who will watch this interview?
Well, I think primarily young people today got to stop and realize what happened in World War II. I like to tell them when I finish the speech out here to the young people, what would have happened if Japan had won the war? What would have happened if Germany would won the war? If you were even here today, what would this country be like? Be proud of this country, protect it, love it, and do anything you do. If you have to go into service, do so gladly and take care of this American flag that flies behind us. I cherish that flag, and I tell a little story of Johnny Cash's about this American flag, and I've read it many times to the groups out here, and it finishes very simple. We raise it up every morning, we bring it down every night, we fold it up right, we never let it touch the ground. I'm proud of that old American flag.
Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview?
Yes, let me say one thing. It's a trivial question. If you've seen the firing squad, they fired 3 volleys. They call it the 21-gun salute. If you've been to Arlington Cemetery, you've seen the soldier march across the front of that platform, 21 steps one way, 21 steps back. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1767, 1767, 21. That's my trivia for today.
Okay. All right, well, that concludes our interview, and thank you for your service, sir.
And I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.